You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Earlier this month, our American Revolution Roundtable met with Professor Richard Bell, author of The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Professor Bell teaches at the University of Maryland. His book examines the international aspects of the war, how this world war affected people all over the world, and also had an extensive worldwide impact with the war's result. Dr. Bell joined our discussion on Zoom. All right, well, welcome everybody to the American Revolution Roundtable. We're joined tonight by Richard Bell, who is a professor and an author of the new book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Rather than me trying to explain what it is, I will kick it off to Rick. Rick, why don't you tell us a little about what your book is all about?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, Mike. I've done a couple of other roundtables in the last 5 years, for instance, in North Jersey, and it's always intimidating to come into a community who've been learning and soaking up knowledge about the American Revolution for much longer than I have. If you know anything about my previous books, you know I'm a newcomer to the field of the American Revolutionary War. My last book was about Philly in the 1820s, for instance, and it was in African American history. So it is a little daunting to be here with all of you tonight, so be gentle if you can. So this book is The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. In short, it is a new global history of the American Revolution. It is about all the global actors who sweep into North America to join with the Patriots or to join with the Patriots' enemies to engage in the war. And it's about all the Americans who ripple outwards and the global consequences of the war, tightly framed around, the war years itself and a few years before, a few years after, but not 250 years of consequences or anything like that. I'll also tell you right up front, this is a synthesis, and I think you all know what that means, but I'm going to spell it out for the record here, right? When you write a global history of the American Revolution, there are two ways to do it. One is the suicidal way, and one is the way I chose. The suicidal way is to spend decades going to every place on the planet and trying to perform meaningful, original research in every archive around the world you can find, and then pulling it together. The way I chose to do it was by pulling together different historiographies, different bodies of existing scholarship on different topics that don't normally talk to one another, that don't normally nestle up against each other in chapters on the American Revolution, and try to say something original and new based on getting my arms around, in this case, 14 totally different historiographies. So, for instance, there's a chapter in my book about the Hessians. We can talk about that later on, I'm sure. There's another chapter about the British in India. There's another one about South America and the Spanish Alliance. These three topics have been around for a while. I'm sure you can think of other books that engage with one of those topics, but it's very unusual for a book to try to tackle multiple topics like that and push them together. So I've been inspired by specialist historians who've been doing important work in archives in one place, maybe Peru, maybe Canton, maybe Ireland, whatever it might be. And then I'm using their insights to help me say, I think, something new and interesting about the war itself and its global dimension. So keep that in mind as we're discussing this, that this is a synthesis of, I think, 20 or 30 years of incredibly exciting, but also incredibly distinct and disparate scholarship that I'm grabbing and pulling together.
You start off the book by talking about the revolution being a world war, and I think we all kind of understand that there were worldwide implications to the war. Why do you think it was a world war? Was it just a matter of the fact that all of the major European powers had colonies all over the world, so anytime they wanted to fight with each other, it inevitably brought in all those colonial disputes and desires to capture or recapture various colonies around the world?
Yeah, I love that question. First of all, there's no fixed academic definition of what constitutes a world war, right? It's sort of like, we know it when we see it, right? I'm going to try not to say pornography, right? We know it when we see it, right? And you're probably very familiar, all of you on this call, with the scholarship coming out of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, saying, you know what, that is the First World War, right? Think of Fred Anderson, Crucible of War. I think that's right on. I think that is the First World War in any meaningful sense. That does not mean that the 7 Years' War or World War One, or World War Two had conflagrations in every acre on this planet or every square mile at sea. That's not what we mean when we say World War, right? We mean sort of multi-theater, boundary crossings, global reach resonance, and ripple effects. And I think on that definition, the American Revolutionary War easily qualifies. One way to make that case is to look at just European powers and say that, yes, this is basically 7 Years' War Part 2, right? That this is France and Spain and Britain, the three great powers of the 18th century, going at it hammer and tongs in various theaters, of which North America is really only one. I remind folks that there's a major theater in the Caribbean Sea. There's a major theater in Central America. I'm thinking Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua when I say Central America. There's a major theater in Europe, in the Mediterranean. Think of the longest siege of the war. It's definitely not Yorktown. That is over in a flash by comparison to the 3.5 year long siege of Gibraltar, which is also where we see the most troops massed in any European uniform. As well. Like the 7 Years' War, there's a major theater in India where Britain and France and the Kingdom of Mysore, among others, are contesting for supremacy. And, Mysore's allied with France and France is allied with George Washington. It's all connected, et cetera, et cetera. And then, I would say that this is a war that originates in part in disputes over Chinese tea. So China plays a role in the Boston Tea Party. I would say that one of the ripple effects of closing down the American colonies to British convicts is the foundation of Australia as a new penal colony as well. I would point out that there's naval skirmishes and fighting in places like Cape Town and Cape Verde and Senegal, and that Sierra Leone is a new British colony founded in part as a direct response to the American Revolution. So what I'm saying is, when you start looking at the geography of all that, that's a lot of places. I'm not saying it touches everyone, everywhere, all the time. I don't think that's true of World War II either, by the way. But I do think it's happening in many places all at once and changing millions of people's lives, both in the 13 colonies that become the United States and often far, far, far away from them as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. But it does seem like it is, at least in this case and in the case of the 7 Years' War, the cause of it is coming out of Europe. It's the European disputes that lead to all this explosion of violence around the world.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? So but I wouldn't ever, entertain the hypothesis that a world war has to begin in Europe, right? I think that would be a Eurocentric sort of thing that Europeans would say, right? I think a world war can originate anywhere and entangle anyone. And I think that the American Revolution is one of those wars where strange bedfellows, different alliances form that take this war into contexts that, the people at the Boston Tea Party might never have imagined. Do you think those 150 guys boarding those three ships to protest the British East India Company, did they imagine they'd be getting in bed with Catholic France and Catholic Spain within a few years? They've been drinking a diet of anti-Catholic pop culture their whole lives. For instance, did they imagine they'd be naming a ship in Philly after the ruler of the Kingdom of Mysore by 1780? Did they imagine they'd be naming their new currency after the Spanish dollar and pegging it to the value of that thing, right? Wars metastasize in very unpredictable ways, which is another way of saying no one knew what was going to happen from one day to another. And, the coalition that eventually forms on the Patriot side and the coalition that forms around George. Think of the Hessians, think of native allies. The Hessians are renter soldiers. The natives definitely are not renter soldiers. These are multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multilingual, and oftentimes globally sourced as well. So I think it's a fascinating story, that one we've largely sort of forgotten when we talk about the American Revolution in public. If you read as many books about the American Revolution as you and I do, and many people on this call, there are plenty of things which may be familiar to you about what I've said so far. But I also think outside of the world of American Revolution roundtables, I think the conflict is often framed in pretty narrow terms as crown versus colonists, as Goliath versus David, right? As redcoats versus rebels. And that's not wrong, but it's not the full story either.
No, absolutely. And you talk to most Americans, they don't realize there was a war outside of New England.
I lived in Boston for 7 years. People in Boston have no idea, right? They
No.
think Boston is the center of the universe.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the British colonists, and they considered themselves British before the
Right.
war, absolutely hated the French Quebec. I mean, there were laws that if, a French priest crossed the border into Massachusetts, he would be executed immediately. Things like that. They had their annual, the Guy Fawkes Day event
Pope's Day, Pope's Day, Pope's Day. Yeah.
where they were literally burning the
They're
Catholic
not
Pope.
subtle about it, right? We really don't like Catholics here, right? And it's very popular in Boston, by the way. Yeah.
It was very funny when they reached out to Quebec to get them to join the revolution. The British basically were started just sending the French all the screeds that New Englanders had written about them over the years and say, you really want to ally yourselves with these guys? So yeah, there was a lot of the need to shift alliances. In other words, a hated enemy became a close ally, and that was a difficult transition for many. One thing that's always kind of puzzled me was why France wanted to get involved in this mess, and by comparison, why Spain so much wanted to avoid it.
Because they both eventually get in, right? Officially, France 1778, Spain 1779, but we both know that unofficially they've been funneling all sorts of resources to prop up the rebels since the very beginning. From Spain, that often takes the form of money, but from both sides, it can also take the form of military supplies, guns and ammo, tents and bandages, and surgeons' instruments, and so on and so on. The Dutch are doing this too. In part, this is just a business decision, right? The Patriots need that stuff, and there are European entrepreneurs, let's say, or arms dealers, if you prefer that language, willing to sell them that stuff. And to the extent that those terms are negotiated, you can see the sort of gentle hand of the French government sort of encouraging those sorts of sales long before King Louis eventually signs that treaty. Some of you may know that there's a French playwright, I think his name is Beaumarchais, who's most famous for writing The Barber of Seville, who's in charge of a shell company, funneling military supplies to the Patriots, which is really coming from the French government, but theoretically, they have clean hands, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, Mike, that to different degrees, the governments of both France and Spain greet the insurgency within the British Empire like hungry wolves. They're like salivating, like Wile E. Coyote or something like that. Not necessarily because they imagine they're going to send their own soldiers in to kick some British you-know-what, but because they hope the Patriots will kick some British you-know-what, and that will cause political instability within the British Empire, which will redound to the larger geopolitical benefit of France and Spain. For both sides, for both France and Spain, they're also well aware that a formal military alliance will set Britain's war machine against them. They can hope to beat up Britain, but Britain can beat up them if they're officially at war as well, right? And the Royal Navy is no joke in this period. On its own, it's the single largest navy in the Atlantic. France, I think, is the second. Spain, I think, is the third. If France and Spain do not get in together, then whoever does get in is still going to be outnumbered by the Royal Navy, right? So when France gets in 1778 and Spain doesn't, even though France invited it, come on in, the water's lovely. France is really under some considerable naval threat that first year till Spain joins them because Britain has the naval supremacy to really go on the offensive there. I would say that the scholarship about why France gets in and the scholarship about Spanish politics is actually pretty well developed in France and in Spain by historians there. I went to a conference in Washington, D.C. about a month ago. Some of you may have been there. Sorry, I didn't say hi if you were there. I was just a participant. I wasn't on the stage. And it was basically a 250-year reflection on the Spanish alliance in the American Revolutionary War. And I would say, maybe 9 out of 10, no, maybe 8 out of 10 presenters were Spaniards sharing their research, which is normally published in Spanish, to an English language audience in Washington, D.C. And I bet there are plenty of people in the audience who were just flabbergasted by how advanced and meticulous that scholarship on the Spanish Alliance was coming out of Spanish archives. The two American scholars that I recall being on the program will be names very familiar to all of you. One was Larry Ferreira, who wrote this great book called Brothers at Arms about the role of France and Spain in the war. And of course, it helps that he speaks Spanish and French. God bless him. How many of us Americans can say the same? And then Kathleen Duval, who I think speaks many languages and teaches at UNC and is most notable as an indigenous historian, but who wrote this astonishing book about 5-10 years ago called Independence Lost, about the nexus of relationships on the Gulf Coast between Spanish people, including Galvez, indigenous people, Black people, British people, and other people sort of around the Florida coast area. But my point is to say that in Spain, they've done a ton of scholarship about why Spain got in and why it waited to when it did. And in France, they've done a ton of scholarship on why France got in and why it chose the timing it did. And that scholarship's often at odds with the sort of mythical stories we tell ourselves from the American side of this. So a great example would be Saratoga. And before I get into this, I'm no military historian. As any of you who know me know, I'm not a military historian. But I'll just say for the record that I think the pop culture narrative is that it's the Patriots' victory at Saratoga that drives France into the war, that it's the permission structure for France to get in. Look, they can win. Let's back a winner. I think that's the version we hear. The French archives throw cold water on that chain of logic, because the French archives make it crystal clear that the Comte de Vergennes, the Count of Vergennes, the French foreign minister, who's basically the prime minister at the time, has been moving chess pieces for more than a year before Saratoga to prepare to get into a military alliance. He's waiting for enough French ships to be repaired or rebuilt or constructed following their decimation in the last war. He's recruiting sailors and cadets and soldiers, and he's on a multi-month, maybe year-long campaign to persuade French doubters at court, especially the finance minister, that this is a good return on investment. The news of Saratoga helps him, but in some ways, it's the last piece in a chain of events which he's been arranging to get France ready here. So I think seeing it from Vergennes' perspective reminds us of what France was putting on the line to get in and what France was hoping to get out of it. You may be surprised, maybe some of you will be surprised to learn that France wasn't terribly interested in gaining territory in the New World. It wasn't really hoping to get Quebec back. If it had any territorial ambitions, they weren't in North America. They were in the Caribbean and they were in India, right, where France does look to pick up some Caribbean islands, kick the British out of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, and see the expansion of French trading posts out there. Those are its territorial hopes, but its trading hopes are equally important. What it does for European geopolitics, right, knocking down King George and elevating young King Louis. It's not coincidental that it's a young king, fresh on the throne, seeking to make his mark, and it's a prime minister who's new to the job and seeking to make his name. That suggests a certain ambition that comes with that career position. For Spain, and I'll be brief about Spain, that we can talk more. I think my Spanish chapter is really interesting, by the way. Yeah. For Spain, King Carlos III, he's in his mid-60s, he's an experienced sovereign and statesman, and he's the one who's witnessed the Spanish Empire face increasing threats from the British Empire for the last 20, 30 years, dating back certainly to the events that lead up to the 7 Years' War, and he is interested in regaining territory lost to Britain over the years. The most immediate example of that is Florida, which has been in British hands since the early 1760s, I think, if I remember correctly. Yeah. He wants it back. He wants to make Florida Spanish again. And then there's Gibraltar, which has been in British hands longer. The date I have in my head is 1704, which is roughly right. Britain's been controlling, the guard post, the gatehouse at Spain's front door and has controlled the entire Mediterranean as a result of controlling Gibraltar. There is nothing more that King Carlos would like than to get Gibraltar back, to make Gibraltar Spanish again. And so when Floridablanca, his prime minister, comes to power, that's the promise he makes his new king. Don't worry, dude, I can get Gibraltar back for you. And that's part of the sort of stakes for Spain on this. So this is not about any sort of ideological affinity with George Washington or Ben Franklin or John Adams. What does the Spanish king have in common with George Washington? Not much.
No, I think quite the opposite. He did not want to set the precedent of American colonies seeking freedom from their European power.
You got it right. You got it right. A Spanish Catholic king in league with Protestant, anti-imperial, anti-monarchical insurgents. That's wild. And by the way, that's one reason why Spain does not ally directly with the Continental Congress. Spain allies with France, and it's France who has to get in bed with the Continental Congress. So Spain has clean hands on that front.
Yeah, I mean, my impression is that at the beginning of the war, both France and Spain saw the benefits of providing covert aid to the Americans.
Yep.
To use a modern analogy, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, the U.S. could, basically drain the Soviet Union on the cheap by just, giving a little covert aid to the rebels there. A few years before that, you could say Russia did the same thing to the U.S. in Vietnam. It's a very easy game to just goose an ongoing rebellion against a major power and force them to, spend much more blood and treasure trying to put it down than it is to actually get involved.
Mike, you're making me wish I'd used the verb goose in my book, and I didn't.
But yeah, so I could see why France and Spain would want to do that. I mean, they'd been at war with Britain for the last 100 years. They only took a break to, rebuild their armies and navies for a few years.
Right. It's like half time in the second 100 Years' War, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I can see why they would be very interested in doing whatever they could to weaken Britain. And this war seemed like a particularly good opportunity for them because in most of the wars, Britain had allies on the continent, Prussia and places like that. And in this one, they were alone. So not only do you have Britain struggling to put down a rebellion halfway around the world, but they also have zero allies working with them when two of their major opponents gang up on them. So it did seem like a good time for the France and Spain to get involved in a war with Britain. Didn't work out so well for them, I guess, especially France.
Yeah, we could certainly talk about consequences if people are interested. But yeah, I just to underline what you said there, right? Britain is used to being a coalition builder in previous wars, and it doesn't get that effort successfully off the ground this time, right? Portugal, its old ally in lots of wars, is distracted fighting Spain, ironically, down in Argentina and other places at the time. Portugal's not a major player in the American Revolutionary War. The Dutch used to be England's allies, and yet in this one, they say thanks but no thanks. And in fact, by the end of the war, they're actually enemies in this war, having profited mightily from gun running and selling weapons systems right up until Britain and the Netherlands eventually make it official in their opposition. We see King George try to get Empress Catherine of Russia to be the one who sends all her troops to go be the troop surge in North America. And Empress Catherine says no. It might have been a different war if she'd said yes. And other states, Hanover, which is ironically George's dynastic state, largely stays out of it, at least stays out of the American theater, I should say, for most of the war. And so George is left, with a figurative equivalent of a begging bowl. He goes cap in hand, looking for, if you won't be my ally, will you at least let me rent your soldiers? And that's where the story of the Hessians, I think, enters the picture here, right? I wrote my first draft of my Hessian chapter before Frederica Bayer published her amazing book called Hessians, which you should all read if you haven't read already, which I think is now the landmark study of Hessians. But thankfully, she'd published a few articles when I was researching this. And then when her big 600-page book dropped, I had to go scurrying to make sure I'd got my arms around that as well. But Frederica, and it's such a good book, please go read it, points out all the reasons why German princes were willing to send out their peacetime army soldiers on someone else's dime to go fight a war where the German princes And the German soldiers, had no real skin in the game. The German soldier trade is a fascinating sort of window into European war making, I think, because the Hessians who go to the New World are in some ways exceptional because the German states have never sent soldiers so far away before, but in other ways are entirely typical. The German soldier trade's been around since like the 12th century or something like that. So we get all these little insights into European politics, European culture, European warfighting by looking at the American Revolution in a global context. But to be clear, if you're just tuning in, folks, it's not just Europe. There's plenty of other theaters and plenty of other groups of people in my book which make this a truly global war.
One of the things you talk about is, well, you start off the book with the Boston Tea Party and talk about how that is really an issue of free trade. Could you go into that a little bit for us?
I can try, yeah. So the Boston Tea Party is complicated, right? And so it's amazing, that this is one of the most iconic milestones on the road to war is the Boston Tea Party. Every school kid, not just school kids in Boston, by the way, every school kid knows something and has been taught something about the Boston Tea Party. And yet, it really takes, like a graduate seminar to untangle the Boston Tea Party because it's really complicated. And we've seen waves of historiography try to pick it apart and interpret it in different ways. And one of the most recent ways has been through the lens of global history, through the lens of commodity flows and monopoly power and corporate greed and taxes and tariffs as well. So I begin the book basically in China with Chinese peasants in the Fujian province cultivating, picking, curing, smoking these tea leaves, stamping them down into wooden tea crates, which end up on East India Company ships, which get stockpiled in London when the East India Company manages to mismanage its own business to such a degree that it has too much supply of Chinese tea and not enough demand, both in Britain and in the colonies, because it's facing competition from Dutch tea traders on the consumer market, both in London and in the colonies. So the East India Company, which is a private company with close ties to the British government, goes cap in hand to the Parliament seeking a bailout. And I hope words like bailout are making you think of 2008 and the financial crisis. Then it should. Because they get a bailout because the East India Company is too big to fail, Mike. 2008 all over again. And the terms of that bailout are known as the Tea Act and a couple of other acts as well. And they allow the East India Company to do something it hasn't previously been able to do, which is enter the consumer market directly, not through middlemen, not through auctions, wholesale auctions, but sell directly to consumers through resellers in Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, and New York. And if you are a Dutch smuggler of tea into the colonies, that's a disastrous new development. And if you're a Boston merchant who does a bit of trading on the side with Dutch smugglers, think of John Hancock, that's a disastrous new development. And so those with economic self-interest in perpetuating Dutch smuggling into the colonies whip up ordinary consumers of tea in the colonies into a frenzy that the East India Company is a monopolistic bogeyman who's going to come and force them to drink their tea. He's going to enter the market at low prices. Then as soon as they've got you hooked on British East India Company tea and driven out the Dutch smugglers, then they'll raise the prices and put the taxes and the taxes on, and soon you'll be screwed. So we need to stop this in its tracks, is what folks like John Hancock and Samuel Adams and Paul Revere are saying in the Boston Prince. And so the Boston Tea Party that results is, the result of that discourse about free trade. Can American colonists buy their tea from whomever they like? Or are they bound by the rules of the Navigation Acts and mercantilism to only get it from approved British suppliers like the East India Company? It's also about corporate greed. The East India Company is bloated and mismanaged and deeply corrupt in ways that seem very familiar to us who read the newspapers today, by the way. And it's also about how the British East India Company might be a stalking horse for the British government itself to sort of put the boot in if they let it. Those are the sort sort of rumors being whipped up there. So I think there's a real global context here, that the fact that the last big event on the road to the American Revolution is an event centered upon Chinese tea being brought to the colonies by an India-based conglomerate. I think we should notice those foreign entanglements and realize that the story is probably richer than the one we learned in high school.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the colonies were really a sideshow for Britain and the East India Company as far as money, economics, wealth is concerned. They were trying to basically sell off excess tea. But the idea that this was about free trade just seemed odd to me, because the Americans never really challenged the Navigation Acts. They quietly did their smuggling on the side to get around it, but they never really denied Britain's authority to have a monopoly on trade and to regulate trade however they wanted. Of course, they were fighting over the issue of direct taxation without representation. Did they put it? Do you think that was more of a ploy by interests that were interested in protecting Dutch tea, or do you think that really was the issue?
So, I don't know what's in people's hearts, right? Which is why we keep getting to write new books about this stuff every few years as people reassess the evidence. And my word may not be the last word, nor should anyone assume it would be, right? This is why roundtables, keep busy every year. There's always new books about this thing. So I would say that free trade is a slogan, really, rather than a deeply thought out agenda, because you're right that plenty of colonists understand that the rules of the game is if the British flag is flying in your town, then you have stipulated obedience and participation in the rules of the game as set from London about who you can trade with. And you understand at some level that your role is to consume what London asks you to consume and to export to London what London asks you to export. So the idea that there is an ideological imperative towards free trade ignores all that evidence of economic loyalty, constitutional loyalty, political loyalty, which has actually only been increasing in recent years. Many of you know that in the wake of the 7 Years' War, many colonists feel more British, more part of the empire than they had at any point, since records began, really. So I think there's some sloganeering there. I think there's some demagoguery as well. And I haven't yet read the new book by Stacey Schiff about Samuel Adams, the revolutionary, but I've read enough reviews of it to know that, she takes on the idea that, yeah, there are some very skilled patriot writers and organizers here who are pushing their own agendas through buzzword slogans. And free trade might be one of those buzzword slogans that does a lot of cultural work, does a lot of organizing work, but isn't as well thought out of an intellectual critique of the British Empire as we might suppose 250 years later. And I'll just remind folks, if you want to go deeper on this, Mary Beth Norton wrote a great book called 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, in which she tackles and examines these issues in more depth than I have in my 20 pages on the Boston Tea Party. And then there's also a great new book by James Fichter, who's a friend of mine who teaches in Hong Kong. I think the book's called Tea, and that is another deep dive into these issues that Mike's raising.
As you say, you touched on a bunch of subjects in your book, and we're not going to get to all of them in this hour.
Yeah, we'll be here all night if you go one by one. Yeah.
Another big component of your book, I guess, was the Native American presence.
Yeah.
And you focus on Molly Brant, who's the sister of Joseph Brant, is actually, I think he was a British officer in the regular army, despite being a Native American. How do you see the Native Americans fitting into this international event?
So yeah, I love that question. Thanks for that, right? So one of the global theaters is the Trans-Appalachian West, right? Anytime we break out of the I-95 Acela corridor, we're really sort of expanding the chessboard, right? And one of the most immediate expansions is Native America, right? And let's remind ourselves that indigenous people are sovereign nations, just like France and Spain are sovereign nations. They make military alliances. They're not renter soldiers. So every time we think about France's role, then bear in mind that, for the Mohawk people, they function in the same sort of constitutional sovereignty there. So I think there's been a flowering of great scholarship coming out of Indigenous history in the last 20 years. I would put Kathleen Duval at the top of that list of great scholars of this, alongside Colin Calloway, Neil Salisbury, many others as well. And I think if I could boil down 20 years of scholarship, I think they would say Indigenous people were central actors in the American Revolution. They are not spectators, they are not bystanders, they're not secondary characters, they are major actors. For them, of course, this is not about taxes and tea. For them, it's about territory and their own sovereignty in the Trans-Appalachian West. I think we're all well aware that westward expansion doesn't begin in 1845, that westward expansion has been ongoing since 1607, and that there are plenty of white European or American settlers pushing into the Appalachian West and encroaching and encroaching and encroaching on indigenous land. So the Proclamation Line of 1763 is an attempt by the king's newfound indigenous allies to get the king to do something about that. And he draws a line on the map and says, thus far, but no further, to white settlers pushing west. Those settlers say, who are you again? You're king? Well, we're out here settling, so we're going to keep going, right? They generally buzz past that line. So when the American Revolution comes along, there's a real crisis in Native America about these continuing encroachments onto or up against native land. And natives have a choice. They could sit out this war and not exert any of their political will, or they could choose a side in a way that could allow them to be a difference maker and then demand protection or gratitude or reciprocity or whatever they want to get out of an alliance. They could exact their terms if they help one side or the other win. So they believe that the king is their best bet. And the king's agents go to Indian country and say, George is your best bet. Don't back the land speculators, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry. Back the guy who drew the line. Remember the line? He could draw another one if he really wanted to. Wouldn't that be great? And so those indigenous nations who do pitch in on one side or the other, the vast majority pitch in on the king's side, not because they love the king, not because they trust him especially, but they distrust the patriots more fundamentally. And they think siding with the king is their best hope of maybe holding back the tide of westward settlement. Now, they back wrong, of course, as we all know, because the king loses. He loses badly by the end of the war. And so their chance to exact...
I'm not sure they had a winning hand there either, though, because
to be sure.
Now we're
right.
back with the Americans, and they didn't do any better in the long run either.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, right? They're stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? So certainly indigenous people emerge from the war in a terrible spot. And the way I would say it, Mike, is that the king's indigenous allies face a real reckoning from the US Army at the end of the war and afterwards. But what's perhaps more tragic is that those natives who'd allied with the Patriots, they don't really do any better. They don't really get what they want from allying with the Patriots either. So I think, framing it in terms of indigenous choices and, like you said, having difficult decisions to make reminds us of just how engaged and mobilized indigenous people were. And I tell this entire story that we've just talked about largely through one person, through Joseph Brandt's sister, whose English name was Molly Brandt. That's not her native name, obviously. And she was the common law wife of an Irish-born British diplomat, Sir William Johnson, before the war. When he dies of dysentery, which is an awful way to die, by the way, before the war, she takes it upon herself to be the sort of glue holding together the British and Haudenosaunee alliance as the war escalates. And that's a very challenging role for anyone, let alone for a widowed, mother of 8 who's indigenous. So I think it's a reminder that women often play central roles in this war. She is very close with her brother Joseph, who you mentioned. The two of them do all sorts of damage to Patriot efforts in the Trans-Appalachian West over the course of 8 years. But at the end of the day, she becomes a dispossessed refugee and ends her and spends the rest of her life in exile in British Canada, having been driven off her ancestral lands by the Patriots and their native allies' slow but steady advance. And that's sort of representative of broader themes, I think.
One of the other, I guess, examples that you kind of put forward to represent an entire people was Harry Washington.
Oh, I'm sure everyone here knows the story of Harry Washington.
Yeah, he's just always fascinates me, the irony, because he was enslaved by George Washington for a time,
Yeah.
and he ends up being a freedom fighter in his own right in Sierra Leone years later, fighting for many of the same principles.
Why is there not a movie, Mike, about Harry Washington? I mean, if I was in Hollywood, that would be the easiest project to greenlight right there. Harry's an amazing guy. He's actually on the cover of the special issue of the Atlantic magazine that I'm sure many of you have seen called Unfinished Revolutions. He's one of several people in that composite portrait of different revolutionaries. I will say for the record that I've known about Harry for maybe 20 years. I'm sure many of you have too, because of the work of a couple of scholars, Cassandra Pybus, an Australian scholar who wrote a great book called Epic Journeys of Freedom, which will blow your mind if you haven't read it, and Simon Sharma, who wrote a great book for the BBC called Rough Crossings, which tells some of the same stories. So I want everyone in America to know the story of Harry Washington, right? I want this to be a chance for us to think about Black Americans and especially survivors of slavery as central characters in the war as well. And theirs is also a global story, Mike, because like Harry, many of them choose to leave revolutionary America at the end of the war with the evacuating British. They end up beyond US borders in British Nova Scotia. Some go to London, some go to the British Caribbean. And Harry eventually ends up in Sierra Leone, this brand new colony where things are supposed to be better. And guess what? They're not.
All right. Well, I've been taking up much of your time. I do want to open this up for questions. If anybody else has anything they would like to ask our guests tonight, now would be the time. Yeah, Bob.
Hey, Bob.
Yeah. Hi, Rick. You talked about the fate of the world in terms of migration of people like the Native Americans, blacks going to Africa, etc. You've also talked about, at one point, the expansion of the British Empire, like in India, etc. The one thing that I don't recall being mentioned at all was, would you agree that the Declaration of Independence was the biggest piece or element of the Revolutionary War that created the fate of the world, in the sense of the Declaration of Independence being adopted by hundreds of countries?
Yeah, great question, Bob. Always good to hear from you. So, if some of you may recognize that phrase in my book title. My book's called The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. And if you're wondering, where have you heard that phrase, the fate of the world, before? It's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, towards the end of his life, I think it's about 2 weeks before he dies, don't quote me on that, in 1826, he's writing a letter to some folks in Washington saying why he can't come to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration celebrations, but he reflects on the significance of the document he drafted in Philly in 1776. And he says, that document, the Declaration, it's proven itself over the last 50 years to be pregnant with the fate of the world. And he doesn't just mean the fate of the US as a new nation on the world stage. He means other places and other peoples as well. And what he knows, and what I'm going to remind you all now, is that by 1826, about 20, 30 groups of rebels and separatists had authored their own declarations of independence as they'd sought to separate from other oppressive powers, whether that's the Flemish people from the Austrian Empire, whether that's the Haitians from the French Empire, or whether that's any of the revolutions in South America that were breaking out all around this time. Think of the rise of Simon Bolivar. All of those groups had written declarations of independence. And the Harvard University historian David Armitage, who wrote a book about this, says that all of them are modeled directly or indirectly on the American original of 1776. So what he's saying, what Jefferson is saying, is what David Armitage says in his book, The Declaration of Global History. He says the 1776 Declaration inaugurated the genre of declaration making by rebels and separatists around the world. And if we skip forward today, and this is what Bob mentioned in his question, Armitage counts more than 100 nations on this planet today that authored their own declarations of independence since 1776 in some way or other, in ways that imitate the Jeffersonian one. So the 1945 Democratic Republic of Vietnam, their declaration actually quotes the American one word for word, copy and paste, right? Others borrow some phrases here and there or suggestive of the same language. But what Armitage, and I think Jefferson, even then at the 50-year mark, is saying is that the Declaration of Independence, which leads to a successful independence movement in North America, is sort of the starting gun for decolonization around the world, right? And look at us now, right? We have largely abandoned the world of empires and largely replaced them with the world of sovereign nation states. And the Declaration is a weapon in that world historical transformation. So I think that's what David Armitage is getting at. I think that's what Thomas Jefferson was getting at 2 weeks before he died. I think that's what Bob is getting at as well. I will say I do treat those subjects very briefly in my book, Bob, but I'm also doing a new project for a platform called The Great Courses. I bet some of you are familiar with The Great Courses. I've got a 12-part, 6-hour new course coming out in April for the Great Courses about the Declaration of Independence. And I will certainly be drawing on David Armitage and Thomas Jefferson and many other people to explore its global legacy.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think it even goes beyond colonialism. It's the idea of self-government, of elected government. That was just not something that existed in the world before the American Revolution.
Yeah.
It was the idea that even somebody who wasn't a colony like France got bitten by the bug, and to King Louis's detriment.
Yes, quite literally, right about there. Yeah, France is complicated, as French historians will tell us here, right? Then it's not like, 1-2 punch. America declares independence, France has a revolution. But yes, you can certainly see, for instance, in the Marquis de Lafayette's contributions to the early stages of the French Revolution, you can see him, at least, desperately trying to import language and ideas from the American Revolution, even if others are like, well, okay, but we should probably listen to what French people have to say as well, dude, rather than just parroting Thomas Jefferson here.
Peter, you have a question?
Yes, I find your approach in terms of looking at this in terms of a world war and the different theaters, very interesting. I guess the question I have just listening to you is if you're trying to tell the story through, like, I think you may have mentioned 12 individual characters, does that kind of skew the presentation where we get kind of a skewed sense of these different aspects of the conflict because we're looking at it more narrowly from the eyes of a particular person who may not necessarily be fully representative of the facet that you're looking at?
Yeah, Peter, I love that question. It's a really smart one. So I wrestled with exactly that as I was trying to figure out how to write this book. And so when you pick up the book, you'll see that there's 14 chapters covering wildly different topics, like, the role of natives, the role of Hessians, the war in the Caribbean, the war in India, you name it. 5 of those 14 chapters, I choose one individual and follow that individual for the entire chapter. So for the chapter about Native America, as we discussed with Mike, I use Molly as my lens. That's not to say I only talk about Mohawks. That's completely wrong. But I will, when I do talk about the Mohawks, I'll use Molly as my lens, but then I'll go gallivanting across other native groups as well and tell you about the Cherokees and the Catawbas before coming back to Molly. So Molly's my touchstone rather than my grindstone around my neck, right? I'll touch her when I want to. I won't, let her dictate the frame of the chapter. But in the other, I think, I can't do math. In the other 9 chapters, they don't have one individual. Sometimes they follow multiple individuals or don't really have an individual at the start. So let's think, for example, of a chapter. Okay, here's one. One of my favorite chapters is about how we get the rise of Australia as a direct consequence of the loss of the American colonies. It's a story we haven't talked about very much. And I open it with a guy whose name is William Murray. And I borrow him from a great book by Emma Christopher, by the way. And William Murray is a jewel thief in London. He gets caught stealing jewels, and he gets sentenced to 14 years hard labor in the British colonies, which means he gets sent to Virginia, Peter, which is where 50,000 British convicts got sent in the decades before the Revolution. He escapes. He finds his way back. By this time, the American Revolution has started, and they can't send any more convict ships to Virginia or Maryland. So they throw him in jail, which is a temporary holding pen in London, while they try to figure out, well, where the bloody hell are we going to send our convicts if we can't send them to Maryland or Virginia anymore? And as Emma Christopher points out in her more detailed scholarship on this, the British government tries every idea under the sun for where they can dump convicts. And William Murray ends up getting sent to West Africa to guard British slave forts, which is as wacko as an idea as it sounds. And he will get shot there, which is another way of saying, Peter, in my chapter about the rise of Australia, William Murray dies about a third of the way through. And so he can't be my touchstone for the second half of the chapter because he's dead. So I will pick up other touchstones who will allow me to carry that story forward, and will eventually see the British Homeland Security Minister, listen for his name, Lord Sidney. Do you see where this is going? Lord Sidney will eventually say, okay, well, how about that Botany Bay place that Captain Cook found 18 years ago? We've run out of all the other options. We've tried Africa, we've tried Honduras, we've tried Canada, maybe Australia. And then I follow some named individuals to Australia as the first fleet deposits them there by the end of the chapter. So I'm well aware, Peter, that sometimes I can't tell the story I want to tell through one life alone. And so I don't follow one life alone. I follow the story. And if there are characters I can draw to your attention on the way, like William Murray, I'll do so. But I'm wedded to the really telling you what you need to know, what I think you need to know about these 14 global stories. Sometimes that allows me to spotlight a life. Other times I get to spotlight lots of lives. Yeah.
If I can just ask a second question, really unrelated, but you mentioned at the outset tonight that, you didn't have an in-depth grounding in the revolution. Right. Perhaps I don't mean to mischaracterize what you said, but I'm just curious if that's the case, what prompted you to devote the effort to the synthesizing of this material about the broad world war entailing the revolution?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Peter. So, for the record, this is my first book about the American Revolution. We'll see if it's my last or not. I guess we'll see how it does. But I've been teaching the American Revolution here at College Park for 20 years, right? So I'm not a newcomer to the subject. And of course, like any teacher at the university level, one way we build our lectures is by constantly reading new scholarship. And so I felt like I was becoming pretty well versed in the ever-changing, ever more exciting and sort of disparate historiographies of the American Revolution. And at some point, I thought that I wanted to sort of tell the world out there just how interesting and capacious and far-reaching this emerging set of historiographies were. The more immediate story, Peter, is, we were in lockdown back in 2020, 2021, and when COVID came into our lives, Zoom came into our lives roughly at the same time, if you remember. And I was giving a few talks here and there on Zoom, and people kept hearing my voice and said, oh, you're British. What did British people think about the American Revolution? And I said, I don't know. Let me get back to you. So I went and read, the last 20 years of scholarship on what the American War was like in Britain for British people, what ideas and contests and stakes they had. And it's a burgeoning historiography. It's really interesting. And I wrote a lecture about it, and I started giving it on Zoom to people that wanted to hear it. And they said, my God, this is fascinating. How do we not know this? And then they said, okay, well, but what about Ireland? What did the Irish think? And I said, oh, okay, I don't know. Let me go off and figure it out. And then they said, but what about India? And so this is basically, the origin story of this book. People bugging me with questions I didn't know the answer to. But like you, perhaps, I was really curious to know the answers. And I knew that there were good answers there if I could knuckle down and read enough books by brilliant scholars in these different historiographies. So this is a pulling together of, shelves and shelves of other people's whole careers to try to say something new and original to the general public. I hope, experts in this field, like all of you, will find lots of new and interesting things in this book. It's written for everyone. but it's also just written for people who pick up a book in an airport bookstore as well, people who give their uncle a book about the revolution for Christmas. And I think this will really overturn some of the sort of perpetual myths we carry around in our heads when we talk about the revolution in public. I'm also hoping Ken Burns' documentary will do some of the same work as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, Peter.
Ed, do you have a question?
I got a question. I don't know if you're the one to ask, but just
Well, I'm the one here.
it made me think of it, so I'm going to give you the shoot in your direction.
Okay.
The French and the Spanish got together late in the war.
Mm-hmm.
Well, did they get together, or did they just both declare war on England, and then they did? What I'm getting at is the Battle of the Chesapeake,
Mm-hmm.
which led directly to the success at Yorktown.
Mm-hmm.
Would the French have been able to divert all those ships, enough ships, to the Chesapeake to fight off the British fleet that came that tried to save Cornwallis at Yorktown?
Yeah.
Would that have been able to happen if the Spanish and their navy hadn't jumped into the war to give the French a little extra naval help?
Yeah. So before you add any extra layers of complexity to the question, let me try and answer it the way you put it. That's a counterfactual. That's a what if question. So I could say absolutely anything now, and no one could refute me, right? Because we can't rerun the experiment with changing one variable. History is not lab science. But I take the premise of your question for what it is, and I think it's smart. When I'm teaching in class about this stuff, I actually did this yesterday. I often show a table, and it's about the number of ships of the line in any given year which are in the water under a British flag, under a US flag, under a French flag, a Spanish flag, a Dutch flag, right? And what you notice about that is the British are on one side and all the others are on the other side, but not necessarily all at once from the start, right? When the war begins, it's Britain, the Royal Navy, versus the American Navy, which, no disrespect to John Paul Jones, there's nothing there, right? It's three men in a boat. So it's the world's most powerful navy versus three men and a dog. It's not a fair matchup. When France joins the war, France brings the second largest navy in the world. And so suddenly Britain does have a real decision about where it sends its ships. Does it send all 70 of its frigates to continue to batter North America, or does it have to go and ring fence Jamaica to prevent the French Navy from, stealing Britain's most valuable colonies? And then when Spain jumps in, Spain is the third largest navy, as I recall. And what's most important about this, Ed, is when you add up the number of ships in the second largest navy, which is France, and add them to the number of ships in the third largest navy, which is Spain, together, they have more ships than the British Royal Navy. They have 31 more ships of the first class, if I'm remembering correctly. Don't write that down. So what that means is when France and Spain do gang up on Britain, Britain has impossible naval choices to make. It's always going to be outnumbered in a matchup if it's playing against both the second and third navies. And of course, the second and third navies sometimes do gang up. Think of the invasion of Britain in 1779. Think of the siege of Gibraltar, the longest siege in the war in 1778 through 1780, 3 years, whatever. And then think of the Caribbean, right? France and Spain's navy, they're not often literally next to each other, but they're both predators in the same zone, which is forcing Britain to devote more and more ships there to staying in the mix and not losing Jamaica. Again, a reminder to everyone listening, from the British perspective, Jamaica is vastly more important than any American mainland colony. Britain, if it loses Jamaica, it might as well, roll up the carpet and go home, right? If it loses Virginia, the British Empire will survive, as we see, actually. So I think you're onto something there, Ed. That's absolutely right. So I think without France and Spain's navies' ability to numerically overwhelm the Royal Navy globally and in any one place at any one time, then the outcome at Yorktown could have been quite different.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting. Thanks.
Yeah. I do treat the Battle of the Capes at some length, actually. I'm not a military historian, but it turns out I love naval battles. And I really happy with the way the Battle of the Capes came out for a few pages in my chapter there. I also treat the Battle of the Saints in the Caribbean in 1782 in some detail. And then in my India chapter, I talk about, my God, the French and British commanders. Can I remember their name? Hughes and Suffren going at each other 5 times in like 6 months. Endless rematches. That's really much more fun than I'm making it sound. Actually. And then the Siege of Gibraltar, which is wild, and every American should know that story too. So naval battles take a fair amount of prominence in this account because it's a reminder that I think that with no disrespect to George Washington, in the age of sail, what happens at sea is just as important as what happens on land.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Troy. I did have one question for Mr. Bell.
Real quick.
The question that I had was just given his position that the global nature of the American Revolution and the values of the Patriots, is this the only place at this period of time, in the 1770s, to bring forth these ideals and capabilities? And, given his global perspective, if not, how soon would there be another population that could put forth a revolutionary movement? And if so, where might this happen? Like vis-a-vis the French Revolution many years later, like, I don't know if there's enough time to touch on that, but
yeah,
I'd be interested.
It's a great question, Roger. Thanks for asking it. I'll be brief here because I think we could dispute different ideas, different responses to your questions for a long time. If you ask 10 historians, they'll give you 10 different answers. I would say that in terms of global significance, there's the Haitian Revolution, which begins in 1791 and ends in 1804. That also commands the attention of the Western world. It maybe doesn't have the Chinese and Indian and Australian dimensions that the American Revolution does, and most of the fighting is confined to the Caribbean around Saint-Domingue, which becomes Haiti. But what it represents to enslaved people around the Atlantic and what it represents to enslavers and to their governments is of seismic global importance. And that's why we see, most Western powers, think of Britain and the United States, for instance, try to suppress this slave-led insurrection. Because if enslaved people rise up and throw off an imperial power and declare themselves free and statesmen of equal stature to a George Washington or a King Louis or a King George, then the whole project of imperial capitalism, I think, is up for grabs there. So that may not be the answer you're expecting or looking for, but I would say the Haitian Revolution is no less significant in global history than the American Revolution.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And folks, if I put my email address in the chat, you can also just Google me and find me really easily. I teach at Maryland. My name's Richard Bell. If you would for some reason like a signed copy of the book, I'd be happy to sell you one and mail it to you free of charge. But of course, Mike also has links which support the round table. So do pay attention to, if you're buying your books from bookstores like Amazon, try and do it through Mike's links so he gets a little commission to support this work.
Well, that's fine. I mean, buy it wherever you want. It's not that big a deal. And certainly getting a signed copy is very cool. So if you want to do that, that's fine. But yeah, Rick, your book, The American Revolution, The Fate of the World, is available everywhere now. So yeah, I do definitely urge wherever you want to get it, get it. It's a great read. I'm sure you'll all enjoy it. It really does put another dimension on a war that we've been studying for quite some time now. Rick, thanks for joining us here on the American Revolution Roundtable.
It's been my honor. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Once again, I'd like to thank Dr. Bell for taking the time to discuss his book, The American Revolution and the Fate of the World. At the end of our talk, Dr. Bell kindly offered to sell a signed copy of his book to anyone who contacted him directly. I've included his contact information in the show notes and in the blog entry for this episode. I've also included a link to his book on Amazon. If you would like to join us live on Zoom for future events, please make sure to sign up for my mailing list or join as a member on Patreon. I send out advance notice to both of these groups every month. Links to join either my mailing list or Patreon are available in the show notes and on my blog. Once again, thank you for joining us for the American Revolution podcast.